Good morning. Welcome to Conversations with Carla. Good morning. Welcome back to Conversations with Carla. I am Carla Harris, your host, and today we are continuing our series, Being Black at Work. And on Friday, we're hosting a chamber town hall talking about Black in the workplace. And as a precursor to that, I thought we would talk about what it means to be Black here in South Florida and just have some candid conversation with two people who would know what that looks like very well. So my first guest is Dr. Marvin Dunn. He is a retired Department of Psychology chair at Florida International University, where he worked for 34 years. He is the author of three books, Black Miami in the 20th Century, The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence, and A History of Florida Through Black Eyes. He is a nationally respected scholar in race and ethnic relations. Our second guest is Kimberly Marie Bonner. She is a fifth-generation Floridian, and she is also the CEO of New Day Consulting Systems. So why don't you help me welcome my guest, Dr. Marvin Dunn and Kimberly Bonner. Good morning and welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. So as I mentioned in our opening, my company, the People Institute, and some partners are hosting a town hall on race relations. And it's really an authentic dialogue about race in the workplace. And because our focus is really how we work with people and unconscious bias, I was having a conversation in all transparency with Kimberly, who said, you have to talk about what it means here in South Florida, because it's a very different animal here in South Florida. So that's what we're doing. And, Conversations with Carla is really about conversations for everyday people. So I have a conversation with a friend, and here we are talking on the show this morning. So thank you both for being here. So Dr. Dunn, I want to start with you. Can you give us a quick overview about Black history in South Florida?
Well, good morning, Carla, and thank you for having me on. And good morning, Kimberly. Good to be on with you. Well, let me just start with 1894, the Great Freeze. When this horrendous freeze took place in Florida, actually the southeast United States, many farmers were forced out of Georgia and Central Florida to move below the freeze line, which meant below Lake Okeechobee. And when that freeze happened, the Florida East Coast Railroad was brought into Miami. It became downtown Miami because a lot of people moved here after that freeze happened, and a great many of the folks who came were Black. At that time, 1896, when the city was founded, we had Black people coming in with the railroad, mainly from Georgia and Central Florida. We had Black people already here from the Bahamas who had established themselves in Coconut Grove and also in an area called Lemon City, which is now Little Haiti. So these all came together in 1896 when the city was founded, with about almost a third of the people who voted to establish the city having been Black men. Women didn't have the vote at that time. So the city of Miami came into being in 1896, and immediately Colored Town, the northwest quadrant of the city, was set aside for Black residents coming into the city. Now, those who already lived in Coconut Grove were okay. Those in Lemon City were okay, but new folks coming in had to live in Colored Town. and they were restricted to that community in terms of their physical presence and movement. They were restricted in terms of jobs that could be had in Miami. Black folks had jobs that required sweat. White folks had jobs that didn't sweat. So we had an economic divide from the very beginning. We had a territorial divide from the very beginning, and stringent racial restrictions on African Americans. Now, this began to change in the 1940s after the Second World War, and a lot of Black veterans came to Miami and demanded equal rights. And we started to have demonstrations mainly by veterans. That's how we got Virginia Key Beach with veterans protesting segregation. So through the 40s and into the 50s, there was a lot of activism in Miami in terms of civil rights advocacy and civil rights efforts. So that by the 60s, Blacks in Miami, still primarily African Americans, were doing pretty well. And then the Cubans came, and the direction of attention, resources shifted from African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement to the newly arriving Cubans. And there's been some longstanding bitterness about that because African Americans had fought bitterly for rights in Florida, in Miami-Dade County. And then there was a sense of being displaced with the new arrivals. So we're talking in the 1960s. By the time we get to the 1970s, here comes the Haitians, a Black ethnic group that moved right into areas that were contingent to the historical African American community, and we had conflicts begin to develop between these two groups. But to summarize all of this and come to the 1980s and present day, we have a lot of residual problems in our Black communities going back to the things I mentioned with the early establishment of a very, very segregated Overtown community, then called Colored Town, with damages that we still see in our community in terms of employment, residential habitation, schools, etc. Perhaps we'll get past some of those things in this new era, but that's a brief overview of where we came from and where we are today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So, Kimberly, you and your family have been in South Florida for 5 generations. So, why don't you share?
In Florida for 5 generations, in South Florida for about 3 generations.
Okay, good. And then, so why don't you give us a brief history about your family's experiences here in Florida and/or South Florida?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Carla, for being the visionary and actually agreeing to have this. I don't think enough people have these conversations about Florida history and Florida Black history. And also, thank you so much, Professor Dunn, for doing the work. And really being an evangelist of sorts in this niche that not enough people in Florida pay attention to. Because my family was a 5th generation, maybe I have a question mark, maybe we're even a 6th generation Floridians, because we didn't find a lot of information about Florida Black history in the 70s. My grandmother created this book, which has my great grandfather, Junius Adams, on the cover. This was a gentleman who was born in slavery, and he actually moved to Manatee, Florida, which is the Bradenton, Sarasota area. And he said to all of his friends that gold grew on the trees. And he was referring to oranges, of course. And so, as you know, or you may not know, the Tropicana plant is based in Bradenton, Florida. And my mom's side of the family kind of developed a small business and were able to pretty much do pretty decently. However, at least with him and his children. It's funny because getting prepared for this conversation, it forced me and my mom to go through memory lane, and we pulled out all these old articles. Like, this is my grandmother, who was a retired teacher. She was the grandchild of the gentleman that you saw on that book. And she was the former president of the Black Teachers Union in the state of Florida. She was a pioneer, not just education, but with the elderly. She was helping to desegregate the beaches. desegregate the parks. And she married this crazy man. Both of them master's degree from Tuskegee Institute, by the way, Professor Dunn. She married this guy, who is my grandfather. And you talk about a bit of a rabble rouser. And I put them up because they really saw some really ugly things in Florida. They saw some ugly things trying to get Black people registered to vote. My grandfather basically had practically a cross burned on his lawn. His children were threatened. My mother was threatened. They had to have like posses of Black people from the world coming out of World War II surround their house to protect them as they were trying to get people to register to vote. And then later on in the 60s, my uncles participated in wade-ins in Florida. I was one of the first children to integrate Coral Springs elementary schools, Coral Springs public schools. My mother was probably one of the first Black teachers in Coral Springs to integrate that school system. People think that Florida is just all sun and fun, and they think that Florida doesn't have this weird history when it comes to Black people. But it's just not. It's just sad that more people don't understand that a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of tears, a lot of garbage, a lot of stuff people went through. And I'm sure Professor Dunn can talk about that in far more detail. I'm just sharing my family's own personal experience. And the bottom line is this: we think that South Florida was this wonderful melting pot for years. And I can tell you, I mean, in the 70s, it was incredibly segregated. Broward County was a conservative county in the 70s. It was an incredibly segregated place. And when I talk about segregation, I'm talking about Black and white, particularly in Broward County, not just, the Hispanic community and Caribbean community. So it's interesting as we're having this conversation about race relations generally in the United States, and we're talking about race at work and being Black at work, we also need to recognize the very weird, unusual kind of soup in South Florida. And it hasn't always been a bed of roses. And I just wanted to share my own family's personal experience. It's not just rhetorical for us. And it's not just something that we can talk about. We have a lived, painful experience. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing. So we are, we've come a long way, I want to think. I think in this country, we believe that we've come a long way. When I look at the news yesterday with the selection of Senator Harris as our hopefully next vice president, it rips the Band-Aid off again. It's the scars never heal because the people don't allow. We're in a constant state of healing in our country. So thinking as we drill it down to our community, because we are all here in South Florida. I am a new Broward resident. And how far have we come really in the past 20, 30, or 40 years? Dr. Dunn, how far have we come?
Well, we've come quite a long ways, but not nearly as far as we need to come. I think if you look at the main advances that we have made as Blacks in South Florida, it has been in employment in the public sector, where you have a lot of Black people working for the school system, the state, the county, and that's always been a bedrock, not always, but since the 50s in the Civil Rights Movement, a bedrock for Black employment. It's been the bedrock of the Black middle class. And that's still holding in South Florida. Where we have yet to make a lot of progress, though, is in Black people being in seats of power. at the top of the chain, in the boardrooms, in the corporation structures. We have not made very much inroads in that respect at all. Black folks are still basically landless, basically wealthless as a group. Although, as I said, the Black middle class seems to be growing and holding pretty steadily. I think overall in race and ethnic relations, if you look back to the 1980s when we really blew up in this community and started killing people in broad daylight, from May 17th, 1980, when I saw those killings taking place in broad daylight, we've come quite a ways from that. I don't think we'll see another race riot like that in Miami. Our Black community has changed. It's now ethnically different. We have a lot of folks here who did not go through the experience of segregation and the violence that accompanied that. So we have a different Black community today that is less likely to blow up like we did in 1980, but we still have quite a ways to go, particularly in terms of accomplishing power at the top of the corporate structure.
I want to invite our viewers to ask questions, make comments, and now is our chance to have this conversation live. So please join us with your questions. So our focus has really been the conversations that I have had since the murder of George Floyd have been around what do we do, what do we do, and we know that voting has to happen. We know that voting has to happen at every level. So not just at the national level, but we also have to make change here. And I will tell you just, honestly, that when I voted the other day, I sat at my computer and I researched every candidate because I wanted to make sure that as much as I could make the proper choice. But voting still, even if we get everyone in place that we want to get in place, it's still like turning a ship in the middle of a lake, right? So we have to be able to do things in bite-sized chunks, which is why my charge as a business owner, community leader, is to create moments where we can make change. So that's how do we make change at the corporate level? So getting people in places to make change is hard. But what do you say to companies who want to make change? Companies who are putting up more than PR statements about race relations within their organization. Kimberly?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, I defer to Kim. Go ahead, Kim.
Companies that are serious about diversity and inclusion can do a lot of things. Number one, they can be serious about building pipelines for their talent as opposed to just giving lip service to that. And they can also be committed to, as Professor Dunn was talking about, making sure that diversity and inclusion includes positions of power, not just the C-suite, but in particular governing boards, because the C-suite in many times is just an employee. But when you're talking about governing boards, you're talking about serious power, and those are conversations that, quite frankly, we've had for over, I want to say, over 20 years. I know in the legal community, we've been having that conversation for a long time. So it's not as if that these conversations, Carla, are foreign. I just think that there is a lack of a will. And I don't know what it will take to get to that place where people recognize that this is important. But it's not because the information is not there. It's not because the expertise is not there. It's not because we haven't been having these conversations. We have. It's just a lack of, I think, will to do that.
Also, I think also that what's happened in Dade County in South Florida is that as we had more Hispanics move into the community, a lot of them have been moved into the upper echelons of the corporate structures in our community. If you look at the number of Hispanics on boards, or CEOs of organizations, they have sort of skipped over or skipped the line in terms of the blacks being in those positions, and for all kinds of reasons. Who uses a particular business, whether they need Hispanics in positions of power. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you have more Hispanics that have moved into top positions in corporate Miami-Dade County than you have blacks, and part of that has been due to the great ethnic shift we've had in our community as immigration has impacted who ends up at the top of the corporate structure.
I think in Broward County, that conversation is a little different. I think in Broward County, you have, I want to say, majority, in many cases, minority, like of the African diaspora in Broward. Not sure about that. But that does not seem to be reflected in a lot of the holes of business power. You might have more public organizations, whether it's our deputy superintendent of schools, obviously our sheriff is now of the African diaspora. Hospital boards may have more of a mix, but when it comes to major corporations that, let's say, are based in Broward, you would think that there would be more of a more people represented from the Caribbean, Black Americans. You just don't see it, and it's I think it's a little bit of a different story in Broward than Dade.
But I'll tell you something about Broward County, Kimberly. Broward County alone could determine who's the next president of the United States. We have such a large, if black folks in Broward County turned out, they could determine which way Florida goes. And Florida goes, whoever takes Florida will win the next election as president. So Broward County is critical in this day for what could happen for the future of this country if Broward County blacks simply get out and vote.
We need to turn that into a commercial.
Oh, really? Well, there's another county that you could say the same thing, Gadsden County, which is majority black. If black folks in Gadsden County and Broward County turn out in really, really high numbers, we will have a black vice president. And Joe Biden would be president.
So we can't forget about him, right? So my vision is that we're going to have a blue map. That's my vision, and I'm sticking to it. Okay.
Me too.
So mark my words. I'm sticking to it. A blue map. So Dr. Dunn, you said that we had an influx of Cubans come in, and so just educate me as I'm not a native to Florida. How did we skip over Black folks here in positions of power?
Great question. As Cubans moved in, the paradigm shifted in Washington, where we had in the 1970s now the emergence of Republican presidents, starting with Nixon and continuing with Reagan and others, where the safety net that had been established during Democratic presidencies and Democratic administrations began to close, became less effective in catching the folks in the very bottom. And that continued right up until we had Obama, and Clinton, but basically the rubric in Washington shifted so that we have a different reality facing us. With both Republican, conservative, cut the social net and reduce government participation in saving people's lives and in providing services. That's the very crisis that we're facing right today, where one part of the government feels that federal government should not be involved in helping states make it on your own, versus states that are struggling to try to meet the demands in light of that abdication by the federal government. But that started in the 70s with Reagan, with Nixon actually, then into other administrations where we saw these great changes in the attitude of the federal government.
So Kimberly, you do a lot of work with businesses, and your company, you work with businesses to scale up and in the franchise space as well. So where have you seen differences in your industry with the ownership of various businesses and things like that in your industry amongst African American people?
Well, it's interesting. I think that, and I don't know what is exactly the causation. I have some theories, but I don't want to speculate. There has been a groundswell of tremendous entrepreneurship when it comes to Black female entrepreneurs. Black female entrepreneurs in the United States are outpacing everybody in as far as just the creation of businesses. This does not get enough attention. I don't know why. And it does not get enough accolades. But across the board, as far as gender, as far as ethnic group, Black women are creating just entrepreneurial entities at a very, very high clip. That's the great news. The bad news is that they are not getting the support, the capital support that our comrades are in other domains. And so, as you well know, everybody knows we live in a capitalist society. If you're going to create a business, capital is your oxygen. If you do not have access to capital, much like George Floyd, I hate to say it, you cannot breathe. What we have right now are an incredibly qualified class of Black entrepreneurs who are not being nourished. And I think that is one point. And I think that needs far more attention. Like in this last round of the Paycheck Protection Program, the money was just not getting to Black small businesses. There's an estimate that 41% of Black owned businesses will become extinct in the next, well, they are extinct because of what happened with COVID. So that needs a lot more attention. So, because in order to have a large business, you have to start somewhere. And it's kind of like having a farm team or having a sports program. You start, in high school and then they become a professional athlete. The same thing applies in business. If we don't have that farm team or we don't have that pipeline of small businesses that can actually become major Fortune 500 companies or Fortune 50 companies, we have a problem. That needs to be addressed. Then there's also the long-standing issue of obviously major corporations not having Black people in positions of power. That seems to be getting worse over time, particularly this past year. The number of Black CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies is just, it's getting smaller and smaller. So that's not good. So the answer to all of this, I don't know what it is. But I know this groundswell of Black female entrepreneurship, we have to support it. And I think what you are trying to do with chambers, what I'm trying to do, more people need to pay attention to that because that's the future.
Can I just add one thing to what you're saying?
Sure.
If you look at the progress of Black people in Florida over the last, I don't know, century, most of the movement for Blacks has been caused by the activism of Black women in Florida, going back to Mrs. Bethune and others who could be mentioned in Dade County and in Broward County. It has been Black women who have gotten Blacks to vote. It has been Black women who have organized for the benefit of Black schools. We have ridden on the backs of Black women to where we are today. I'm telling you, Mrs. Bethune didn't trust Black men. When she wanted to get people to vote, she went to the churches and got Black women out to get the men to vote. So I'm hoping in this new day, particularly with Vice President Harris coming onto the stage, that Black women will once again continue the tradition of carrying Black people forward. Whether you're Jamaican, Bahamian, African American, it is going to be the Black females who take us through the next era into what I hope will be a new day for America.
Absolutely. Well said. So as we come to the end, I always like to ask my guests, what are the top 3 things you can leave us with? So food for thought. What are those things that you want us here listening today and those who go back and watch the video? What do you want to leave us with? So Kimberly, let's start with you. What do you want? What are the top 3 things you want to leave us with?
Just that as it relates to Blacks at work in Florida and Blacks at work in South Florida, there is a history as to how we got here, right? So number one, we need a better understanding of what happened before today to really understand what the dynamics are. So understanding our history. Number two, really appreciating how far we have come. To Dr. Dunn's point, we've made so many advances, particularly in the public sector. But that public sector advance needs to transition into the private sector, particularly as it relates to, in my opinion, capital formation and the long-term success and viability of Black-owned businesses. That will be critical to changing the trajectory of the Black community. And then lastly, if I could just say this related to the wonderful immigrant story in South Florida. As a student of immigration law, when I was in law school, one of the things that you can see, the arc of immigration law was very, very conservative and quite frankly, very, very racist. And I have receipts. You can see the immigration laws in the early part of the 20th century were very, very, very conservative and very, very racist until the civil rights movement, until the 1960s. It was the work of people like my grandparents and people like your relatives and people that look just like us that helped to pave the way to understanding that America is not just a white country, but America is a diverse country. And that acknowledgement and credit, really, of the people who paved the way in the civil rights movement changed and actually influenced the 1965 immigration statute, immigration law that actually prevented so much discrimination on the basis of race and nationality when it came to immigration. We must have this reckoning conversation. And it annoys me to no end when we have these conversations about diversity, particularly in South Florida, where it's almost like, oh, we're diverse because we just woke up one day in South Florida and we just said we were going to be diverse and we were going to have all these wonderful people. And it just because we're just wonderful, sweetheart, and it just didn't happen that way. And I hope we will get to a day when we have these conversations grounded in truth. And I think that will move us forward. So those are my 3, and I'm done.
Okay, Dr. Dunn.
Schools, schools, schools. We cannot allow our schools to fail. We are where we are because of education, and our schools are failing. Second, vote, vote, vote. If you don't vote, don't complain. There's no reason to allow what has happened in this country to continue unless people don't vote. And then third, have some fun. Smile. It's not that bad. A new day is coming. Have some fun. We have to stay at home, of course, but listen to some music, dance with the kids,
Yay!
smile.
Yeah.
But let's not let this gloom and doom bear us down so that we can enjoy life. Smile and have some fun. Put on some music and have a dance, even if it's just the kids and the family at home. Have some fun and relax.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the wisdom from both of you. I really appreciate your time. I've learned from both of you about this new place I call home, and it's really exciting. So I just want to close it out, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us today on Conversations with Carla. Join us next week on Monday, where we will be talking about the wealth gap, being Black at work. Next week, same time, same place. Take care.